tell the story of what happened in October of 1919, you really have to go back to understand how important Corbin was as a hub for the L&N. But it's really not until the teens, and especially World War I, that the coal industry really ramps up, and that affects Corbin because it was the receiving yard for all the coal that came out of Harlan County. And so in 1910, International Harvester builds the company town of Benham. And then with World War I, there's a boom in steel manufacturing, so U.S. Steel spends millions to build the company town of Lynch in Harlan County. And the Harlan County total coal tonnage goes from well under 1 million in 1910 to in 1920 it's something like 3 or 4 million. And so with that increase, you have to increase the size of the receiving rail yard, which is exactly what these black workers were sent to Corbin to do. They were housed in rail cars and in tents on L&N property. They were not meant to be a permanent fixture in the town. Just like other African Americans leaving the South at this time in large numbers, really for the first time, they were heading to industrialized areas, in this case, Eastern Kentucky and really southwestern Virginia. And so in February of 1919, the L&N announces plans to upgrade the Corbin yards to the tune of several $1,000,000. And they bring up these African Americans from the South to work as construction workers in the yard. There were some African American families already in Corbin. One of them, her name was Emma Woods. She was the matron of the passenger depot and also ran a boarding house. And there was also the family of Alex Tye, who was an African American porter in the master mechanic's office. And so these were African Americans that had lived in Corbin, in some cases owned homes, and had had roots in the area before the arrival of this fairly large work crew arrived from the South to live and work in the rail yards. There was a construction road paving crew from Louisville. They were working on paving Center and Main Streets in Corbin, and that was about somewhere around 40 workers, and they were also living in a boarding house. So really for a town in 1910 that had a total of around 60 African American residents out of 2,500, this increase of several hundred was a pretty dramatic one. On the night of October 29th, A.F. Thompson, who was a switchman for the L&N, was heading home after attending a carnival in the rail yards. And the story as he tells it is that in the woods, he was overtaken by 2 African American men, members of the work crew, who stabbed him, robbed him, and left him for dead. And from there, he crawls to his neighbor's house, who was a physician, and he was in pretty serious condition. And in the aftermath, it's actually discovered that it was not 2 of the African Americans from the work crew. It was actually 1 or 2 white men, possibly in blackface, that robbed Thompson. And this is borne out in several reminiscences from Corbin residents. And throughout the night and the next day, rumor circulates around the town and really in the rail yards themselves. In the morning, a man named Pistol Pete Rogers, his real name was Stephen Peter Rogers, but his nickname was Pistol Pete because of the gun that he liked to carry and wave around. He and another L&N worker arrive at the cars of the construction foreman for the L&N, and they interrogate him. They want to know if he knows anything about this stabbing and robbing that happened the night before. And they also have some of the black workers there who deny all knowledge of the incident. The construction foreman says he doesn't know anything about it. But then throughout the day, other rumor circulates. There's a sign posted in the roundhouse in the yards that says, quote, "All Negroes will be run out of Corbin tonight." And another construction foreman for the L&N is measuring up some rail during the afternoon and overhears railroad workers in the yard sort of plotting and planning for what's going to happen later that night. And all of this stuff is available in testimonies that are publicly available, and you can read them. And about 9 o'clock, some of the black workers report hearing gunshots in the south end of the Corbin yards, and this is really the start of the mob action and what happens throughout the night. And some of the construction workers come to the foreman and they say, "What's happening?" They say, "Look, we're in trouble. We need you to help us." So the foreman goes to the chief of police and he tells him what's happening, and the chief of police says, basically, "We're helpless. Look, I can't do anything about it. Just kind of go along, don't cause any trouble, and all of this will be over. They're not going to be harmed. They're not going to be killed, but just look, do what the mob wants you to do. So the L&N construction foremen buy tickets for their black workers. They send them to the passenger depot and they buy them a ticket out of town. And what's interesting after that is that the mob doesn't stop with the construction workers. From there, they go into the town and they start going to different spots that they know that African Americans are either boarding. So in the case of the road construction crew, they know where they're boarding at, and they know where African Americans are living in the town. So they make stops at each of these places and order African Americans out, and they order them to the depot. But they come across a marching band at a Republican rally at the graded school. The mob sort of commandeers them and forces them to march along with the mob. And again, in this testimony, it's interesting to see that members of the band sort of don't realize what's happening until they sort of look around, and of course there's occasional gunshots. Eventually they realize that, they are being used to do a racial expulsion, and some of them protest and want to get out of line. They don't want to do it, and Pistol Pete Rogers, in the testimony, it's said that he orders them back into line and says, "Follow Pistol Pete. We're going around town, we're rounding up all the African Americans in Corbin." So this process is repeated throughout the night. They go to the Railroad YMCA, they try to get the janitor, who was African American, out of there. They send him to the depot. They round up the African American road construction crew, send them to the depot. But it's not as orderly as that, because there are instances in some cases where African Americans just run. And they run to Barberville, they run to London, they hide in the woods. They're not all sort of orderly being sent to the depot. So it's a chaotic scene in many ways. Really, the expulsion lasts from about 9 p.m. to about 2:30 or 3 o'clock in the morning, when the last train leaves for Knoxville, Tennessee. And after that, the very next day, Alex Tye, the porter that I mentioned earlier, he had been hiding the entire night in the storeroom of the Manhattan Hotel, which was right across the street from the depot. And he was hiding with his stepson, and his wife had found solace with another white family in town. And so they all kind of meet up at the house around 4 a.m. and they find that the house is just like utterly ransacked. All of their stuff is stolen, money is stolen, weapons, jewelry, anything like that. And so from there, they move all of their stuff to Barberville, because they know they can't live in Corbin anymore. And again, in Alex Tye's testimony, he talks about this, that they would take trains back and forth every single day, starting at about 10:30 to about 3 p.m. So they were not there after dark. They would just come during the day, get what little stuff they had left, moved it to Barberville, and then from there, they moved to Ravenna, Kentucky, where Alex took a similar job with the L&N. In the immediate aftermath of the expulsion, other stories like this are evident. There are some African American baggage workers that were run out that night that try to return later on in November to work again. And I believe it's the third shift of the railroad workers, so really the dead of night, are walking around in the yard, and they basically tell them that you're not welcome here anymore. Over the next few months, the work of the expulsion is sort of carried out through word of mouth. This happens on October 30th, but after that, the rumor starts to spread that it happened. I have heard stories from people that say that there were killings on that night, and of course the newspaper reports were vastly different in the immediate aftermath. There's one, I believe the newspaper from Mount Vernon says that there were 5 or 6 African Americans killed, and the New York Times article says that there may have been 1 African American that was killed, but of course that was not the case. And through the years, the story has of course changed and shifted depending on who's telling it. And I have heard rumors that there was a lynching, but based on what we know from, the testimonies and the contemporary newspaper reports, there was nothing like that happened. So in 1920, there are only 3 African Americans left in Corbin. There's Emma Woods, the matron of the depot, a boarder that lives with her, Steve Stansberry, and a man named John Berry, who was a servant for a wealthy white family in town. Most of the time with things like this, with racial cleansings, with lynchings, the parties are never apprehended. It's always parties unknown. The Commission on Interracial Cooperation is an important player in this. The first state director of the commission is James Bond, who was an African-American World War I veteran. And the commission is started in Atlanta in 1919, really in the midst of Red Summer, to improve race relations in the South. One of the members of the commission is the Commonwealth's attorney for Whitley County. His name was J.B. Snyder, and he played a pretty large role in bringing this case to trial and prosecuting the members of the mob. And the L&N was still under control of the U.S. Railroad Administration at this point. So again, in the governor's files that are in Frankfurt, you see this correspondence between Snyder, between the attorney for the L&N, trying to figure out, how can we prosecute these people for what happened in Corbin. J.B. Snyder, the Commonwealth's attorney, is really the one that brings the indictments in Williamsburg, the county seat of Whitley County, against Pistol Pete, Steve Rogers, and multiple other members of the mob. And that's how we get these testimonies from both white and black residents of Corbin that were there on that night, what they saw, what they experienced. All of this comes out in the investigation. In September of 1920, only Steve Rogers is sent to the state penitentiary for 2 years for the charge of confederating. So out of all of this, all these indictments that were handed down, only the ringleader, Pistol Pete, went to jail for any amount of time. But it's also interesting because 1 year into his sentence, a group of over 300 Corbin residents petitioned the governor to either end Rogers' sentence or reduce it in some way. And it's really interesting to see what they lay out as the reasoning for, first of all, the mob itself, why it was necessary to expel all of these African Americans. And they say that it was because they were lawbreakers, basically. They use words like they were gregarious in acts, lawless in deeds, a mighty host of colored lawbreakers. All of this is spelled out in this petition. If you look at the Corbin Times newspapers for the weeks leading up, there are crimes being committed, but in large part they're being done by white people. And they close it by saying that the fact that this expulsion was carried out in such an orderly manner without excessive violence reveals that really the whole community thought that it was necessary, and that this was just something that Corbin wanted done. It wanted these African Americans out, and over 300 people signed it. But we know that not everybody in the community agreed with this, because on the night of the expulsion, white Corbinites that tried to shelter African Americans from this and tried to stop the mob in several cases, but were prevented from doing so either by the chief of police or by the members of the mob themselves, basically saying to get out of the way and don't get hurt. Corbin builds on this in many ways. The act itself lasts one night, but the effects of it last for decades. I think it's because the story itself becomes something that people sort of harness and tell to each other, tell to their family members, tell certainly to African Americans that are traveling through Corbin to, not stay, you're not welcome here, kind of thing. Being willing to talk about it and to put this out in the open, I think, is important. And to really tell the honest history of what happened, putting these sources out there and having people read them and talking about it and being honest about it, about what actually happened, is maybe a way to move forward. And I think that doing what the Sun Up Initiative is doing there are these giant placards basically of this testimony out there where people can read it.
On the 100th anniversary of the racial cleansings that occurred in Corbin, a group of community members and students from the University of Kentucky banded together to commemorate the event and shed light on the tragedies that happened. The people of Corbin hoped to become a sun-up rather than a sundown town.